Hello and welcome to students in EDUC1635. My name's David Hewitt and we're continuing on our Maths 1 lectures. We're up to lecture 4 already, and this lecture is going to be about constructivism. And you might remember from the tutorial last week that we looked at that model of PCK, the pedagogical content knowledge, which we also included context into that. And so pedagogy is the big P in that, and the part of pedagogy we're going to be talking about this week is this idea of constructivism. So let's settle down and get going. Okay, so here's an example of a classroom from yesteryear. Have a quick look at it. How do you think this is different from the classrooms of today? Fairly evident. We can look straight at the clothes, the style of the desks. Kids are sitting in rows and columns. There's a huge big blackboard on that wall. There's some cursive writing on that wall, some shapes. So yeah, what other judgments would you make? What sort of teaching do you think would happen in that classroom? Well, we could assume that the content, pedagogy and context intersecting circles here, the content would have been king in this class. And it would have been driven by purely a lot of book learning, a lot of writing. The pedagogy would be what we call didactic, and which means it's just it's a passing on of knowledge from one student to the other. So the teacher would be very full on the knowledge of the subject, but the pedagogy would be very limited. It'd just be this one pedagogical approach, which we call didactic, which is just talking to the students, and a lot of rote learning and a lot of drill and practice. Knowledge of the student, there's probably a little bit of that going on in the classroom in the contextual understanding, but it probably didn't influence the teaching so much because the focus was really on this didactical approach. Thank heavens education's moved on in the 100 years or so since this photograph was taken. At least one would hope that it has moved on and not returning to times like that. In those days, they used to think the students were just what they called a tabula rasa, or a blank slate, and it was just a matter of peeling back the forehead and pouring in the knowledge, and the students would naturally retain that. But in 2015, this quote from Goldman and Pellegrino says that students do not come into the classroom learning situations as blank slates. They are not tabula rasa, as was previously thought. Rather, students bring conceptions of themselves in their worlds, and they include their students' beliefs, the knowledge that they have, the language that they use, and their discourse practices, how they speak to each other and to yourself. And all of these conceptions come from lots of experiences in their homes, communities, and prior schooling. So in this quote, Goldman and Pellegrino are fairly strongly looking at the C for context in those three intersecting circles. So students aren't tabula rasa, but that was the thinking in the olden days. So here's an example. When you're ready, you can just have a play with this, stop the video or pause the video while you have a look at trying to solve this problem. We're wanting to get from building 32, which is over near the roundhouse, you can see, try to locate where we are in our building in education, and that would be 36. And we're going to get diagonally right down to the opposite side of the university in building 14. How would you do that using a minimum of 5 turns? So just stop and play with that idea for a little while. Think about what's the longest, the shortest distance you could take, the pathway that you could take from 32 to 14. Could you get there using a minimum of only 4 turns? How would you do if you got there using a maximum of 6 turns? So again, we can change this understanding up, but when you're ready, just pause the video and have a go at this, challenge yourself, and then restart. Well, what we're trying to show you there is this idea of constructivism, and constructivism is that learners play an active role in constructing their own meaning and constructing their own learning. So not back in the olden days, it was very teacher driven. Here we look at the students to play an active role to construct their own learning. That's constructivism. We now understand that knowledge is not fixed, and it can exist independently outside of the learner, and it's constructed and shaped by experience. After all, how do babies learn? if they don't construct their own experience. They're not taught in a didactic process by their mothers and fathers, although there's some rote and repetition that goes on. But a lot of babies construct their learning from birth. And then thirdly, we have this term which we're going to unpack a little bit later called social constructivism, which acknowledges that learning is a personal interpretation of the world, a personal interpretation of the environment in which learning is taking place. And learning actually requires a social interaction, and that's vital. So we need to talk to others about it. We can learn independently and individually, but in order for us to really understand what's going on around us, we need to have this very strong elements of social interactions. So that's what we call social constructivism. Students constructing their own meaning, but using a socially interactive model to do so. What else is constructivism? Well, the constructivist approach requires learners to be active and confident in themselves and abilities. There's a role for the teacher to make sure that we do construct learning activities so the students are the focus and are active in that. And they develop confidence. They're willing to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes and build upon the knowledge. It takes confidence for learners to admit that there are gaps in their knowledge. So again, we need to build classrooms where students are comfortable to say, look, I don't understand, or can you show me how, or I'm not sure where I'm going along this pathway. So again, it's a lot of building relationships with the students so they're comfortable to say that they don't understand. And particularly in a classroom where they're so conscious of their peers, and perhaps their peers understand and they don't. Second dot point, constructivism emphasises problem solving and understanding, and probably you're getting a really strong understanding that the 4 proficiencies in mathematics that cross all the mathematics learning that we cover involve these 2 elements of understanding, fluency, problem solving, and of course there's also the reasoning side of the language. And the last dot point here about constructivism is that we try to use authentic tasks and experiences, settings and assessments, so that relating back to the map, the map of the campus, and asking you to construct a pathway through that, that's trying to use an authentic task that you can relate to. You can see it on a map. You've had experience walking around the campus. You've had experience walking up and down the streets of Fremantle. So we rely upon that knowledge that you hold to be able to build this authentic task, which is hopefully meaningful. So social constructivism, and this is, I said we'd talk about this a little bit earlier. So what is it? Contrary to what some people think, particularly those who favour a more didactic approach, social constructivism is not about not being a teacher. So what I'd like you to do is just to stop again the video and just think about, what do you understand by this double negative? What do you understand that social constructivism is not about not being a teacher? Pause, and when you're ready, come back and we'll continue on. Okay, so what does it mean? It's not about not being a teacher. Well, of course, you still have to be able to direct and support and plan for the students' learning. So social constructivism isn't about just letting the students free, although that's one pedagogy you might like to use. But the teacher's role there is to direct that learning, to make sure that those learning sequences are in place, to understanding where the level is at the student currently, what do they know and understand, what can they do, what could they do before that to lead to this point, and what do I now need to do to lead them to this next point in their learning journey. So teachers are very much guides. They are really important in a social constructivism model, and of course around the idea of building these social interactions that are really important. At times the teachers need to engineer that. So social constructivism does not mean you step back and just watch it all happen and it's all free range. No, it means there's still a lot of planning, a lot of thought, a lot of thinking, a lot of order, a lot of organising into that. But rather than being driven by the subject matter or the content, you're actually driven by the needs of the students and the context that they bring to the learning. And the little cartoon at the top probably exemplifies this a little bit more tongue-in-cheek, but I'll expect you to be independent, innovative and critical thinkers who do exactly as I say. Well, of course, we want students to be independent, innovative and critical, and we do want them to follow our instructions, but we also want them to have some thoughts and abilities and ideas of their own, and feel free to express those in a socially appropriate way. Of course, we need to teach those structures as well in the classroom, the expectations of how we communicate between ourselves, between students and between teachers. All part of the role of the teacher to develop that. So being a teacher in a social constructivist model is still really an active and key part of it. Now we go back to two schools of thought around the constructivism, and there's a couple of key people in here. So the first one was cognitive constructivism, and the likes of Piaget, who had his levels of development, and then von Glaserfeld, who also developed in this this phase as well. And then there's these two social constructivists, Len Vygotsky, which you're going to hear lots about, and also Barbara Rogoff. So let's have a look at these two. So Vygotsky, and you'll hear this lots in your teaching practice and in your learning, this whole idea of the zone of proximal development, or ZPD. Vygotsky came across this idea that he observed in that second sentence that when children were tested on tasks on their own, they rarely did as well than when they were working in collaboration with an adult. So that was one observation. The zone of proximal development, though, goes into a place where we are engaging students to refine their thinking to make it more effective. And how do we do that? He also said the development of language and articulation of ideas was central. And again, in the mathematical sense, we can't have the students use the reasoning proficiency unless we have taught the language of the mathematics with which we want them to reason. I'm going to keep coming back to that because I think it's so vital that sometimes we think the content is just about a formula or an algorithm. It's not. It's around actually teaching the language that we want the students to be able to use and reason with as well. So let's keep going on this idea of the zone of proximal development. So here it is, and here's a model for it. So in this little diagram, we can see this area where the child's comfortable. The zone of proximal development touches on that and extends beyond that. And there's this beyond present reach. So I describe it like this. I call this just-in-time learning. So the zone of proximal development for me is looking at where that student is sitting comfortably in their learning and being able to introduce that next phase in their learning. We sometimes call it challenging and stretching goals, because we want the students to be able to stretch their learning and be challenged within that. And we need to know what that next step in their learning process is, and not perhaps just give it in a didactic way, in a directive way, but get the students to explore and understand that and actively create their own knowledge and understanding. So again, the role of the teacher is to provide for that to happen. What we don't want to do is to take the students from where they're comfortable into beyond the present reach, because that's where lack of confidence comes in. That's where students can't go into that place in a confident way, because they become frustrated in their learning because it's too far to go. So the zone of proximal development is at your judgment. It's that little comfortable place where you can think of it as what's challenging and stretching that I need to do to introduce the child to the student to in their next step of their learning journey. I know what they know. I know where they've come from. Now, what is it I need to do to build this next step in their journey without making it frustrating for them and turning them off? So that's what I call, or that's what Lev Vygotsky called, the zone of proximal development. In my terms, I call it a just-in-time learning. People might vary. Margaret Rogoff was the other social constructivist, and she made these key points that learning requires the active involvement of the learner. We've gone over that before. Collaborative learning is essential. So no longer do we need to have the students sitting in rows and columns, not talking with each other. We have the kids sitting in groups, collaborating. We reform those groups so they get a chance to work with lots of different kids, not just the same kids, not just in a homogeneous way or heterogeneous way in terms of learning levels, but we mix those things up. But the ability to collaborate, that social interaction, the social construction is so important. And this need to develop learning communities or communities of learners, where we talked about Carol Dweck's growth mindset. This is where this comes into it as well, because we have a learning community where the learning is shared by this community. It doesn't rest on any one individual. So three really nice points in terms of this idea of the social constructivist pedagogical model. So constructivism, what do you need to do? Well, the teacher needs to do all these things. Needs to adapt the curriculum to students' needs. To be able to do that, guess what you need to know? You need to know the curriculum. You need to know the curriculum at the level that you're introducing to the students. You need to know what built up to this point, so in previous years and previous levels. And you also need to know what would be the next steps. Where is this learning leading to? So to be able to adapt curriculum, you have to have a really strong understanding yourself. Helping to negotiate goals and objectives with the learners, well, that comes back to the PCK, the second C, which is context and understanding the learner themselves. What is it they know? What can they do comfortable in a stretching and challenging way without frustrating them? Negotiating them isn't in terms of, oh, would you like to? It's actually trying to support the students with setting goals and objectives for themselves, which are realistic and reasonable. We need to pose problems of relevance to students, and that's authentic learning experience, because we need to make learning relevant to them. We need to emphasize hands-on and real-world experience, and hands-on, we've been trying to do that in our tutorials where we're using lots of material, concrete materials, to give you that idea that this is where the learning starts. Starts with the hands-on, the concrete material, and we build from the concrete through the representational through to the abstract when the students are ready. We need to seek and value the students' points of view, because if we don't understand what it is they think and why they think that, how can we find that zone of proximal development to move them that one step forward? If we don't understand what it is that they think, how they think, and sometimes students might have misconceptions and we need to find out what that misconception is and correct it. And sometimes students might need challenging, they might need to be opened up to explore and extend themselves. So again, understand the students. And then lastly, of course, provide that social context of content. So what's the relevant social understandings that we need in this idea of constructing students' learning? And Galileo probably summed it up perfectly. You cannot teach a man anything. You can only help him find it within himself. So the role of the teacher is to help the students find that point of knowledge within themselves, and then also start to build and construct their own knowledge. So if that's what the teacher needs to do, what does the student need to do, beg your pardon? Well, they need to be comfortable being within a community of learners. They need to understand what collaboration means among fellow students, and collaboration is an active and a supportive process. It's not where one person dominates or one person shies away. And we need to teach these skills to support the students in their collaborative processes, and sometimes we might need to structure groups so that there is a possibility for all students within that group to have an equal say, because as you know, some students might want to dominate conversation, so we need some structures to manage the quiet students, as also be able to manage those students who I call blurt, the blurters who just sing out, call out, and that's their thinking style. That's perfectly okay, but we need to be able to manage that as well. So collaboration doesn't happen between one student in a group of 4. It happens between 4 students in a group of 4. We need to set up structures how that can happen. Part of that is this third dot point, learning and a social experience, that some people don't have the same perspective as ourselves, and that's okay. We need to be able to appreciate that, but also we need to be able to justify and reason why we have these perspectives. And once again, reasoning, one of the maths proficiencies. And of course, the student needs to take ownership and voice in the learning process. Doesn't mean that the teacher doesn't take ownership and provide voice. It means the teacher supports the student to take ownership and voice. So again, very active role for the teacher in constructivism and in social constructivism indeed. And that little graphic in the top right hand corner is quite nice as well. Have a look at that. Assessment, success, or assessment and differentiation leads to success. We could probably talk about that a little bit more in the tutorial. Interestingly enough, when we're looking at this model of social constructivism and the pedagogy that it relates to, I probably shouldn't be showing you this slide, because when we look at, on the left-hand side, the average student retention rates, and the right-hand side, the methodologies that we use for students to retain knowledge, we can see in these 3 different studies, Fuller in 15, Glasser, and then Sousa in 2005, have all come up with something similar, that the worst way we can get people to retain knowledge is simply lecturing to them. And yet it's a model that we still pervade at university. And as you come down that, the next thing is just reading to them. And you can understand that lecturing is a didactic process. We try not to do that, but obviously in an online lecture, I can't do anything else other than be didactic in my pedagogy. And similarly, reading, it's a very passive for the learner. Audiovisual, we might think that looking at things is one way to learn, but again, it only has a 20% retention rate. Demonstrations have a 30%, but look at practical doing. So demonstration, when it's me demonstrating to you, has some effect, but when you actually do it yourself and when you talk about it, 50 and 75% respectively, and then look at what happens when you teach others, 90%. So again, where is your focus in your classroom when you're building this social constructivist model, when the pedagogy that you're following is social constructivist? What are you going to be doing? Yes, there are times when we just need to talk to the kids. We need to lecture them about some knowledge. Yes, sometimes there's some reading, etc. But to get the best bang for the buck, top three, talking about it, that social interaction, that social discourse, the collaborative talking about, the actual doing, 75%, and then once you have that knowledge, try to teach someone else what it is that you've found. And that's, as this model says, a really effective way to retain knowledge. Think about what your best learning style is. Mine, certainly, listening to a lecture is never my favourite thing to learn any content. Hattie in 2010, if you haven't come across Hattie's name yet, he's a luminary in education circles, and he's been doing some amazing work, which in some ways we put too much faith in and misinterpret, I think, the larger message he's trying to give teaching. But anyway, there's a conversation for another day. But Hattie said, the more the student becomes the teacher and the more the teacher becomes the learner, the more successful the achievement outcomes. So again, we're kind of switching roles here, and just think about what is it the teacher needs to do to become the learner. What is it required for a teacher to be a learner in this content? Think about the PCK model, and perhaps the teacher becomes a learner by understanding the student, each individual student a little bit more. What's their context? Where have they come from? What's their learning? What can they do? A focus on the positive, Carol Dweck, growth mindset, not a focus on what they can't do. That's easy. But let's focus on what they can do and then use that idea of the ZPD, the zone of proximal development, to take them on the next step along that successful learning journey. So it's not really turning things on its head, but it certainly is a different to a didactic approach back in the old days. So what does constructivism mean? Well, it means teaching to learning. It's all these things. So it means shifting the emphasis from teaching to learning. Constructivism individualizes and contextualizes and considers learning style, and that's looking at students' learning, and that's about the C again, the context and the PCK. Middle row, knowledge in construction. It's not just reproduction, it's not rote learning, it's not drill and practice, it's not regurgitation, it's knowledge in construction. And on the right hand side of the middle line is meaningful and problem based, and we've talked about that already, real authentic experiences that the students can relate to. Down the bottom half of that, bottom third of that model, we need to negotiate the meaning, because of course some students might come to an understanding from a completely different or erroneous path. So we need to get them to talk to us about what it is they know and what they understand. And again, that's the reasoning part in the maths curriculum, the reasoning proficiency. We use authentic tasks and we use a lot of reflection. And that's looking at prior knowledge and building new knowledge. So we use authentic tasks and reflections to say, well, this is what I already know, and this is what I now know as a result, or this is where I want to go. So constructivism, nice little model for you to think about when you're looking at your lesson plans and developing those experiences that are constructivist in nature and cover those 8 key points there. So we need to be teacher-centered versus student-centered teaching. We need to understand what that means. We know that teacher-centered is very much a didactic approach, whereas the student-centered comes back to the social constructivist model, that pedagogy. And when we compare the two, this goes back to a table constructed by Huber and Feed in 2000, but you can just stop the video when you want to and just read the comparisons for yourself. Let's start in the first line though. Knowledge is transmitted from professor to students. That's a teacher-centered paradigm. But in a learner-centered paradigm, what happens? Well, the students construct constructivism. Their knowledge through gathering, and synthesizing information. They integrate it with general skills of inquiry, communication, critical thinking, problem solving, and so on. What's your role as a teacher in that learner-centered paradigm? What would you be doing to help students construct their knowledge? Second line, left-hand side, student-centered paradigm. Students passively receive information. Right-hand side, students are actively involved. And again, what's your role as a teacher to ensure that students are actively involved in their learning? And of course, in any class, there's going to be a range of students' level and ability and understanding and attitude and disposition to the subject. So how do you manage to keep all those students actively involved at a level which, think about the ZPD model, which is challenging and stretching at their need, but doesn't take them into a place where they become frustrated with their learning and then turned off? Read down those lists, compare them as you go, and as you read the left-centered side, the right-centered side, I beg your pardon, the learner-centered paradigm, each time ask yourself the question, what would I do to facilitate that? How would I make that happen? How is my classroom going to fit a learner-centered paradigm? How's it going to model a social constructivist pedagogy? When you're finished reading, just restart the video. So I think we've made the point in summary. Constructivism is active, reflective, and social. It's about doing something, it's about thinking about something, and it's about doing it with other people. So those three key points are what we seek to develop in the classroom. And at the end of the day, in your lesson planning, if it's active, reflective, and social, you're then reflecting a social constructivist or a constructivist learning pedagogy, learning and teaching pedagogy. Again, perhaps just stop the video when you're ready and just write down for yourself so that you're really summarizing what you think or you understand by the lecture so far. Just write down 5 words or phrases that you would use to describe you as a social constructivist teacher. What 5 things or what 5 phrases would you choose to say, well, this is what sets me apart. This is what someone coming into my classroom would say, oh, yes, that's a social constructivist teacher. Stop the video, take some time to write it down and think about it, and then when you're ready, restart. Okay, I hope you found those 5 words and you can put those into your teaching philosophy as you start to develop your own particular practice. I'm just going to finish off with some ideas around, just to take the pressure off a little bit, looking at this idea of learning our tables, and you might have learnt them in a very different way, but I'm just going to make the point that there's lots of different ways that we can learn, in this case, our multiplication facts to 9. And the people in my tutorial know that I think that patterns are the underpinning of all mathematical understanding. So let's have a look at some patterns in terms of learning our 9 times table. I've saved you the process of having to write them down. So once 9 is 9, 2 times 9 is 18, all the way down to 90. But you might have learnt that by rote and chanting. Once 9 is 9, 2 9s are 18, 3 9s are 27, 4 9s are 36, which is fine to learn by rote. But if I suddenly asked you what are 6 9s, do you have to go back and chant to yourself once 9 is 9, 2 9s are 8? Oh yes, until you get to 54. So we're trying to dispel that. That's an old didactic method of teaching. That's a rote learning, drill and practice. How else can we look at it? Well, let's have a look at this idea of patterns in mathematics. And you might have already seen this, but let's look at the first one. If I put a 0 in front of the 9, once 9 is 0, 9, 0 doesn't make any difference in that place. It doesn't change the magnitude of the number. It just tells us there's zeros in the tens place. But let's have a quick look down the column and we can see 0, it's not there. It just goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. What do you think the next number in the tens place would be if we can look at that as a pattern? So it would be 11 9s are 99. Oh, so the pattern's not being held. 12 9s are 108. So that's a 0. Explore the 9 times table beyond the 10 and just see, does the pattern now disintegrate or does the pattern change? Nonetheless, there's a pattern there and we want the students to be able to identify the pattern and then be able to extend it. You try yourself. 11 9s, 12 9s, 13 9s, 14 9s. Is that the only pattern you can see? Well, you might have picked up there's a reverse pattern now. So we do start at 9 and we're on a countdown. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Oh, 11 nines. If we extend the pattern, 11 nines are 99. So in the units column, we've got a 9 again. 12 nines are 108. Oh, we've got an 8 in the units column. Again, explore for yourself. Now we've established the pattern going down. Does that pattern repeat itself, or is it just a simple aberration? Can you see any other patterns that might exist in this times table, as we'll call it, this multiplication facts for 9? Well, I think there's two others that you might be able to see, and these are kind of reversed. So I'm going to start at 5 nines are 55. 5 nines are 45, and 6 nines are 54. 54 is the reverse of 45. 4 nines are 36, and 7 nines are 63. Oh, that's the reverse. And you can see as you go up and down those pairs of numbers, you can see that the numbers are actually reversed. Why is that the case? It's a nice thing. Remember, the whole thing around the tutorial activities are a nice activity, but where's the maths? In this case, it's a nice pattern, but can we understand the maths of it? Why is that happening? And can you explain that to the students? Any other patterns that are happening there? Well, my tutorial group know about digital roots, and I spoke to them about when we look at once 9 is 9, we just look at the 9. A digital root is bringing the number down to a single digit. So 0 is not there. 0 plus 9 is 9. 2 nines are 18. When we look at the 18 and we add 1 and 8 together, 1 and 8 equals 9. 3 nines are 27. 2 plus 7, 2 and 7 is 9. 3 plus 6, 4 nines are 36, 3 plus 6 is 9. And if you follow down that column, I think you'll find, if you didn't know already, that when we add those numbers together, add the digits in the numbers together, it's always going to end up 9. 11 nines are 99. Well, 99, 9 plus 9 is 18. We can take it to a single root. 1 plus 8 is 9. Yes, that works. 12 nines are 108. 108. 1 plus 0 plus 8 is 9. So this is actually a test for whether a number is divisible by 9. So not only do we know our multiplication facts for 9, but if the digital root of the number is 9, it simply means that number is also divisible by 9. And you can explore that for other multiplication facts as well. But again, we could simply drill and practice this 9 times table, or we could start to develop some understanding and some fun around patterns and why those patterns occur. So more importantly, not just the magic of the pattern, but try to get an understanding of what's the maths behind the pattern as well, because that's what we need the students to understand so that they can apply their own learning and knowledge. So having done that, as a teacher with a social constructive pedagogy, how will you teach or have the students learn their times tables, as we might call them? Are you a didactic teacher? Will you do it by rote and drill, in which case the students have to go through and just memorize the facts? Or are there other ways that you might introduce into your classroom that are a little bit more engaging, that follow a social constructivist model, that can more readily have the students understand and apply their knowledge of times tables and access the strategies around that, simply rather than having to recall or regurgitate from a list of memorized facts? What will you do? You might stop and think about that. Okay, well, I hope you've enjoyed that little journey down constructivist learning. I hope we've convinced you of the importance of being able to ensure the students are at the center of learning at all times. I hope you understand it does not diminish, but actually enhances and makes more complex our role as a teacher. Really easy to stand out the front and teach in a didactic way. There's no responsibility on the teacher for the students' learning, but in a socially constructivist way, you have a great responsibility to make sure those students are learning, and their learning journey has that process where we understand now this idea of the just-in-time learning, as I call it, or the zone of proximal development. What is it that they need to develop their learning next along the learning journey? Anyway, thanks a lot for listening. Hopefully a little bit shorter this week than in last couple of weeks. Have a great week ahead. Bye.